So thanks, Russ, for having me and for organizing the meeting. Thanks, Franklin, for all the logistical help here. One of the great and terrible things about going to meetings on meta science is that all the people who are participating come from different content domains. My particular content domain is child language research. So I'm a developmental psychologist and cognitive scientist who works on how children learn the meanings of words. And so hopefully this is a case where you get an enjoyable intro to a completely different domain area in the process of learning about some of the meta science issues that come up there, with hopefully some generalizable insights that come out of that. If this starts out seeming like a talk on how children learn to talk, that's because in part it is, but that's not where we'll end. So let me first begin by reminding you that this is an exciting problem to think about. So this is my bread and butter, both in the workplace and also at home. So I watch a couple of kids learn language, and just want to remind you, it is really crazy to see an organism that is fundamentally alien in a lot of ways turn into one that looks like a person. Walks around, talks to you, manipulates your emotions, gets what they want, all using verbal communication. And this transformation happens extremely fast. It's also important to think about the incredible applied value of studying child language acquisition. So with the increasing accessibility of conversational agents, we're reminded every day just how little their interaction style is like a small child, how difficult it is for them to capture some of the nuances of conversation that are already appreciated by a toddler, even though they're fabulous in other ways. And finally, this is a really important applied issue. Early language sets the stage for later academic success. So whether a child is succeeding in communicating using language very early on in development is a strong predictor of how successful they will be in learning to read when they hit school. And this all happens quite fast. Here's my daughter, Madeline, around 18 months. Longest thing she'd said was happy bee, or happy birthday. She combined words at 19 months, a blue ball. It's the first word combination, so that's like a big psycholinguistic milestone. I was very excited. By 23 months, she's observing facts about the world. Spike Doggy, that's my mother-in-law's dog. Spike Doggy, no food, eat dirt. That's true, he's a Chihuahua and he doesn't eat food, he eats dirt. And then at 26 months, she's a teenager and she says, Dad, I move own body. It might need a little bit more space. So this is just to give you a flavor for how quick this transition is, right? So at 26 months, she's a couple pounds heavier, a little bit longer hair and so forth. But there's really almost no physical transformation. In contrast, the communicative transformation is immense. So how does this happen? This is, I think, one of the deepest questions in cognitive science and psychology. In recent years, psychology in particular has been under constant self-examination and external examination for what it might even mean to explain a psychological phenomenon like language acquisition. In particular, we've been having a discussion about whether, not only is there a reproducibility crisis and a replicability crisis, can we repeat our experiments, can we reproduce our analyses, but also do we have a theory crisis as well? Do we even know what an explanation should look like in this area? Here's one paper by Oberauer and Lewandowski on the theory crisis. Here's another about the dearth of theory in psychology, and a nice one by Tagliarconi on the generalizability crisis. So the general theme that we've heard coming out of the modal psychology study is maybe we're not learning enough about the theoretical underpinnings of human cognition. Well, I want to try to show you a little bit more about this case study of child language to give you a sense that this is not all psychological science, that in fact there is a kind of really rich and interesting interplay between theory and data, and that interplay is critically enabled by a reproducible ecosystem in which data sharing is used as the backbone for theoretical insight. So that's where I'm going to try to give you a sense of why a particular type of data sharing or flavor of data sharing I think is critically enabling of progress in theory. So why do I think we're doing okay in terms of theory in some sense in this area? The particular case study that I focused on in a lot of my work is children's early word learning. So in particular, learning that something like doggy maps to this particular stuffed dog that we're playing with, and maybe the broader concept dog. So this is like the kind of minimal unit of learning, right? Because you guys probably know 40, 60, 80,000 words. So there's that steady drip, drip, drip of word learning throughout the lifespan, but it's going very fast at the critical time period that we care about. And so we can break down the microstructure of this big accomplishment, learning a language, into these little accomplishments of learning each individual word. And in my doctoral thesis, that's exactly what I did. I made a computational artifact, a small statistical model that could be fed some data about what words kids were hearing and what objects they were seeing, and would try to make these mappings, make hypotheses about these mappings, and it was reasonably good at this. In fact, I think this overall micro area here was a resounding success, in the sense that a variety of different models from different computational statistical traditions came out around the same time. These are artifacts, computer programs, could feed in data, get out predictions. And all of these models, and a bunch more that I haven't put here, all made the same basic statistical predictions about the same big phenomena in this area. They all did stuff that kids do in some schematic sense. So actually, in some sense, I think we're doing fine on theories in this area. But if we dig a little bit deeper, these computational artifacts that we were trying to create, these learning models, are scientific hypotheses about learning. So the assumptions of these computational artifacts are, in fact, assumptions that we bring as scientists to our explanation of the phenomena. They're fundamentally theoretical artifacts, or theories. And if we examine them in that sense, then the problem that we run into is not a problem of theory, it's a problem of data. Our inputs to these models, in the end, were actually about 20 minutes worth of videotape that I had annotated in a cafe at one point during my doctoral thesis. And our outcomes were a handful of binary experimental results. Kids do X, kids don't do Y until 18 months. Or in some cases, general descriptions of average developmental changes. Children's vocabulary acquisition is exponential in shape. Okay, well, let's find an exponential curve somewhere in there. So what I want to argue to you is that quantitative theory evaluation actually, in this case, required more data, that there's a virtuous cycle between theoretical exploration, having the statistical models, and the need for data. So let me just make sure that I kind of spell out this argument a little bit more. So what do we get by having more data? Well, first, I mentioned that what we were trying to model, what we were trying to explain in our theories, was binary transitions, or general developmental patterns. If you go to a developmental psychology textbook, or a babycenter.com, or whatever your source of developmental insight is, say you have your own kid, or a grandkid, or a neighbor's kid, and you want to know something about them, you'll get something like this diagram. This is a good one, by the way. This is by an expert. This is a kind of an ages and stages diagram that tells you about the particular phenomena that are cropping up at particular times. So we learned that children are doing canonical babbling around 7 months. That's the ba, ba, da, da, ma, ma, that kind of stuff. What does that mean, though, right? Should I be worried if my kid doesn't do it at 7 months? Does this mean kids in Palo Alto, who are children of PhDs and fed the best and brightest educational apps, they do it at 7 months, or do they do it at 5 months, or at 10 months because the apps are terrible? What do I think about variability on the basis of a picture like this? So clearly there's a bit of a granularity issue in these kinds of developmental descriptions. Further, there's a fundamental lost opportunity for us as theorists of development, in the sense that there's concurrent to all of this theorizing in cognitive science and so forth, there's actually a basic policy discussion that's been going on the highest levels of government, at least until recently, about how to address socioeconomic disparities in children's early language. Many of you have probably heard about the 30 million word gap. So there's a whole bunch of institutional and governmental attention paid to this issue that largely ignores all the theory that I was talking about, because we didn't make contact with actual data about variability between individuals. We can't tell you whether what it is about the environment of a low socioeconomic status kid that is leading to lower vocabulary outcomes and hence worse reading outcomes when they get to school. So the fact that we can't give you a good statistical description, or better yet, a good explanation of those phenomena, means that we are essentially leaving this policy debate on the table to be had by folks from other fields. Finally, or penultimately, I mentioned that we were attempting to give statistical descriptions of binary experimental phenomena, but there's good reason to think that if you try to over-describe one of these phenomena, you may not be able to get that same phenomenon in another sample. And so this might not be a really good target for modeling after all. So this is a figure from a paper that I'm sure most of you are familiar with by a large collaboration, trying to repeat a number of psychology studies from 2008 and largely failing to do so. So about a third of the studies found point estimates of the effect that were statistically significant and were judged by the new experimenters to be a kind of general replication of the original. This is kind of study zero of what's now become a pretty burgeoning literature, redoing psychology experiments and finding something pretty similar, that fewer of these individual point estimates that you might bend your theory around are actually estimates that you would want to bend a theory around, because it's quite tough to get them to work again in a new sample. So these might not be good modeling targets, might not be good targets for theory. Finally, and maybe most distressingly from my perspective, even the simple analyses in those papers may themselves not be reproducible. So you may not be able to get back the same numbers that you were bending your theory around, even if you had the data from the original sample. So this is a study that was led by Tom Hardwick. Tom was a postdoc at Metrics, co-supervised by Steve and John. And in one part of this study, we sampled 35 articles from the journal Cognition, which had an open data policy. These were articles that had, in principle, reusable data associated with them. So they'd already passed our first screening, which was that the mandatorily deposited data had been deposited and that it had enough metadata and was complete enough to be, in principle, reusable. So then we sampled 35 of these, and we tried to redo all of the statistics with the inclusion criteria that the statistics had to be at the level of an undergraduate experimental methods textbook. Of these, and these reproduction attempts were two people. So it was a pilot, as we called it, so often a student, and then a co-pilot, which was me or a senior biostatistician or Tom, going over the analysis. This is, each of these took somewhere between 5 and 25 hours per attempt. This is like doing a crossword puzzle for psych statisticians, right? You could basically bring any piece of knowledge that you might have acquired anywhere in your career to bear on trying to figure out what in the world this person meant by the ANOVA that they claimed they did in their paper. So in 13 of these cases, we reproduce all the numbers in a paragraph of their results section from their data with no contact with them. That's about a third. In another third, when we reached out to the authors who were 100% responsive, we did recover those numbers as well. And in the other third, roughly a third, neither we nor the authors could figure out exactly the provenance of all of the numbers in their results section. There were a variety of diagnoses for these. Maybe their analytic specification was not clear. For example, the incorrect formula for the confidence interval that they had applied and the correct formula for the confidence interval which we had applied did not produce the numbers in the paper. So nobody knew where the confidence interval came from. Unidentified typos. The data they had uploaded weren't the data. The data they replaced it with also weren't the data. Nobody knows which data were represented in that graph. These sorts of things. So now I should say that none of the substantive conclusions of these articles were undermined by these changes in the analysis, which maybe could tell you about the coupling in psychology between the interpretation and the precise numbers that are reported. So that's one issue. On the other hand, our erratum rate was at least 3 authors from this 35 article sample expressed a desire to substantively correct their published work. So that's about a little bit less than a 10% erratum rate from the sample. It's a very noisy estimate, but it suggests that we really need to do better in terms of our linkage between the data on the one hand and not just the analyses we report, but then the theoretical constructs that we're trying to evaluate. So this is the fundamental gap that my work tries to address, that by virtue of our limited amount of data and limited contact between the data and the models, we're really not solving any kind of, or not addressing the theoretical opportunity that we have available. Okay, so where are these data gonna come from? Well, as Russ said, there's been incredible enthusiasm about data sharing lately. And so we have a whole range of wonderful data sharing repositories, Figshare, OSF, Dataverse, just to name a few. We even have our own developmental psychology video repository, Databrary, which is a wonderful resource. But all of these resources store completely unstructured data from different projects. There's no fundamental aggregation opportunity beyond the fact that these are data of some sort. They're numbers related to things, sometimes in psychology. So putting them to work in the kind of theoretical role that we're interested in is simply not possible. To take a page from Alan Newell, who he said, you can't play 20 questions with nature and win. You can't find a whole bunch of different psychology experiments and put them together and make a theory, right? We need to actually move back and forth between the kinds of highly structured computational theories that we're trying to develop on the one hand, and the types of data that we need to aggregate to evaluate them on the other. So the fundamental thesis of this talk then is that what we need are, at least in some cases, domain-specific repositories which store data, not just in general, but about theoretically relevant constructs, that the theory has to actually apply to the data sharing infrastructure, and then the data sharing infrastructure can in turn inform the theory. So to support this kind of theory building, of course, these repositories must be open and programmatically accessible through APIs and other forms of access. And then you get these major benefits that result from metadata sharing across the repository. So by virtue of knowing something about the format of the data, you can then make use of that in much more productive ways than you can a pile of interesting CSVs from different experiments on different populations with different variables. Okay, so the rest of this talk in 3 repositories. I've asserted that there are models of children's language learning. That's about all I'll say about such models, even though they do exist. And I want to tell you about how we've thought about capturing the talk that kids hear, that is the input to such models, the data about how children do in experiments, and then the broad trends in language learning. These are the 2 kinds of outcome variables that we're interested in. So basically, the life cycle of evaluation of theories needs to be supported by data in all of these ways. And I want to tell you a little bit about what we've learned by trying to construct repositories that allow us to understand these data sources. So let's start with the input predictors. So it turns out that child language actually has been doing this kind of data sharing way before most scientific fields. Surprisingly, for an area that's not so cool, we were pretty hip and with it. And we sort of had the original big data for child language. Actually, starting in the early 80s, Brian McWhinney and Catherine Snow and their colleagues were going around sharing all the photocopied transcripts of all of the extant child language data with collaborators. That project has evolved into Childus, the Child Language Data Exchange System, which is an open repository for child language data. It's got a shared research environment. There are a bunch of open tools and resources. So there's a lot to build on here, which is very exciting. And this kind of work has been a kind of classic example of how data sharing creates opportunities. There's, I don't even know the most up-to-date number, but as of a couple of years ago, there were something like 3,000 theses and papers that made use of the data in this repository, and that's almost certainly an underestimate. So this is generally great. In terms of documenting children's early environment, we're doing quite well in creating a theory building resource that's been very productive. But there are some real challenges that come up when you try to do this in a more rigorous computational ecosystem. So this is a paper that I was involved in a couple of years ago, led by Stefan Milan, who was at that time a researcher in my lab. So we were interested in a very niche, tiny question about child language, which is whether children know that and the in English are actually part of the same grammatical category. This is a big theoretical issue, but it's a pretty small potatoes in some sense. And we constructed a new statistical model of the learning process that kids might go through, tried to link it to these data. And in our paper, we have this kind of innocuous table that describes the results of from the model with various statistics. And the row variable in this table is what data preparation that we used for this. So what particular parsing pipeline we used to get from the raw data to our model. And in some sense, this is totally, by the by, normal process of science. But I want to highlight that this table is a very polite way of saying we have no idea what the other people in this literature did in terms of their data prep. They took in a whole bunch of structured text from that repository that I mentioned, and then did some stuff to the result. And probably they had some scripts, or maybe they had an undergrad who was copying and pasting, or we don't know what they did, but we can't get any of those numbers back. So we're just gonna do it a bunch of ways and show that whatever data prep way that we use doesn't actually affect the results too much, and it didn't, largely. Of course, any failure like this highlights an opportunity, and so we thought, what could we do to actually keep this from happening? What is the difference between a repository, that is somewhere where you can download all this data, and a structured resource that wouldn't keep us from having this pipeline problem? Well, what we ideally wanted was a system that would allow us to query a database for exactly the kind of data that we wanted, returned to us in the format we wanted, with all of the pre-processing steps cached, that is pre-done by somebody who knew what they were talking about, not just us fooling around with our simulation study. So that's what we set out to build, and a couple of years later, we put up a draft of that. So this is a repository called ChildisDB. So it's a flexible, reproducible interface to the child language data exchange system. So this is essentially a wrapper layer that helped us gain some insight into what I think is necessary in general in these kinds of repositories. And this is the work of Stefan Milan, who I mentioned, and Alessandra Sanchez, who's there on the left. So let me just now switch over to Childis. That's your Slack. Yeah, it was. There we go. Yeah. Great. Okay. 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 So so this is ChildisDB now live, and so we can actually look at the database. So there's an underlying database backend that ingests the full repository of text, then does all that pre-processing and loads it into a database, and provides an application programming interface. Actually, let me go back to that. Let's see. No. Okay. So having provided an application programming interface, a way of accessing the data programmatically, then becomes extremely easy to build interactives on top of this. So what we've done is make use of some rapid prototyping tools in the R programming language ecosystem, in particular, a package called Shiny, that allows us to create interactive visualizations using those data being pulled in real time. And then we can look at, for example, the word frequency of the word the versus the word ball in child language or speech to children. We can do kind of interactive manipulation of this. And so if we have another favorite word like table, we can add this to the mix and so forth. So this becomes our little Google Trends, but for young children. So this kind of flexible visualization then allows researchers to kind of rapidly play around with hypotheses, fact check claims, and so forth, and allows them to play around in a semi-reproducible way. We have kind of link sharing functionality. You can share analyses of this versioned database that underlies the computation. So that's kind of a fun tool that you can build, but the primary thing that we're actually building on top of is this R application programming interface that allows anybody to access a particular snapshot of the data. So we remove some of this reproducibility uncertainty by providing a code-based way to access the underlying data in a particular version with a small number of kind of well-maintained database calls that allow folks to go in there and get what they need in the version they need. And presumably, if you go back to that paper that we worked on, what we would have liked them to say is, we used this database version 2016, and here's the code we used to pull in those data, and that code will now forever, or at least for a little while longer, pull in the same data by virtue of having a particular version number, a particular API call, and then we would be able to reproduce those numbers, or at least attempt to reproduce those numbers from the underlying data. So the insight then from this project was that what we want is not just data. We want an interface to data that allows us to access those data with the appropriate preprocessing, the appropriate structure, and the appropriate versioning, so that we can then reproduce the analyses from that ecosystem. Okay, so we started out by looking just at talk that children were hearing. Now we want to move on to outcome variables, the things that we want to predict from our models. So in the next section, I want to discuss this issue of how to archive data from experiments on children, especially given that individual famous findings, as I mentioned, are not the best levers with which to build theory. We want to think about how to more ecumenically, more systematically gather information about experimental findings. So recall that I was sort of gently criticizing this kind of ages and stages diagram, where we choose a particular milestone and an expert asserts that at a particular time period, we observe some milestone in children's development. Now, this has a bunch of issues, as I mentioned. There's the binary point of emergence. There's the illusion of a stage-like transition, when in fact, knowledge grows systematically and gradually. There's, of course, a lack of variability in the estimate across individuals. And then more broadly, there's a much bigger lack of variability estimates across cultures and societies, since the generalizations we try to make hopefully are valid beyond the particular context of collection for the data. So just zooming in on a particular milestone, infants produce vowel-like sounds. This is cooing, like ah or ooh. What might we want to do to try to enhance this, this particular picture? Well, we might want to force these milestones onto a common common metric. And in fact, such a metric exists. Statistical meta-analysis was developed for such a case study, so we can force these into a scale for unit effect size. We could then assert a particular point estimate for a particular milestone at a particular time. We could put variability on that. We could even put some kind of parametric or non-parametric curve on that to try to make a hypothesis about what's happening developmentally, what's changing. And then we could try to compare this to the same sorts of curves across development and across other phenomena. So this sort of vision then is one in which we use statistical meta-analysis to try to actually reconstruct a more data-driven ages and stages growth chart, where we're trying to actually take the empirical literature and recover the kinds of assertions previously made in these expertise-based growth charts. So in order to begin doing this, we created a website called MetaLab. This is a repository of meta-analyses for cognitive development research. So it turns out that there is varying uptake of meta-analysis as a technique in different subfields. So the biggest stumbling block here is simply getting the source meta-analyses for us. In order to address that, we've begged, we've pled, we ran a competition with cash prizes, and that's resulted in us getting a number of meta-analyses into this repository. So now I'm going to switch over to the live repository again. So this is the live repository online. So you can see we now have, I guess we don't have summary stuff. We now have 19 meta-analyses on early language, a few on early cognitive development, representing a much larger viewpoint on the literature than these individual studies that make up the meta-analyses, which typically have 16 or 32 infants in each of them. So having done this, we now can create the same sort of interactive toolkit with the same sort of structured, accessible data set that's available to users And so we're using the same kind of prototyping tools to be able to evaluate and assess the particular phenomena of interest online. So say we're interested in language development. We can move over to a phenomenon like the infant-directed speech preference, the fact that babies like baby talk. And now we can assess different statistical models, add moderators, look at developmental trends, consider a variety of classic diagnostics of publication bias, and so forth. So this kind of interactive meta-analysis now allows us to really dig into the experimental data and assess what kind of endpoints we want to take from it. So in a more sophisticated study, we might take the entire meta-analysis as our endpoint and try to predict the variability and the developmental change and the moderators on this particular phenomenon from our model. On the other hand, if we were using this more as a checkpoint or a milestone in the model, at least we can use the best available point estimate from the meta-analysis as that particular phenomenon to be predicted. So now we can take from these data at the granularity that we are interested in the sorts of insights that we want, rather than having the mediating layer be an expert who reads the literature and summarizes with a single point. So now we have variability and point estimates that are adaptive here and are outcomes. Further, this is a really nice resource for us to do the kind of meta-scientific proofing of the literature more generally. So we can actually apply publication bias diagnostics, overfitting and p-hacking diagnostics systematically to this database and assess the health of this particular literature. I won't present those results here, but as an aside, actually this is a pretty healthy literature. So surprisingly, there's relatively little publication bias per se in this literature that we detect. There's of course some, there's always some, but it turns out when your study population is expensive enough and complicated enough, you publish a paper about them. If you do the study, you then make up some stuff to say in the paper, probably based on post-hoc exploration of the data, but you do publish the paper. And so actually there's relatively limited diagnosis of publication bias here. So that's quite nice. So we actually have some general belief in the estimates that we derive from this resource. And playing around with it really allows people to assess their own degree of confidence fairly transparently in this particular literature. So there are also a number of tools on the site for power analysis and planning. And finally, hopefully creating sites like this actually in turn creates an incentive for students to think about doing meta-analysis, summarizing the literature, and then contributing back to the repository. So in the same way that the existence of the child language data exchange system, the Childless repository that I was mentioning earlier, has created an incentive to make these transcripts, get them in Childless, and have them be reused. Here, creating repositories for this particular domain creates an incentive for folks to be part of the main repository of meta-analysis. So again, this is a theme that I want to highlight, that a domain and subfield or question-specific repository actually creates a set of incentives that are not present by the creation of something like a Figshare or an OSF or a Dataverse in the same way. These are fabulous resources, but nobody says, I just have to get all my files into Dataverse because everybody's looking for whether my files are in Dataverse. There are some kind of broad incentives that happen, but if you are creating the single resource for a particular community, then the incentives are much stronger, because if your data are not reported in that repository, then in some sense you're not part of that community's conversation. So these social incentives get amplified by virtue of being part of a community-specific and question-specific repository. Okay. So on to the last repository, and this is the one that I have, in some sense, the most to say about, because it's actually the one we began with. We're interested in broad trends in language learning, and the repository that we built to capture these trends is called WordBank. So the starting point here is that if you want to know broad trends about kids' early language, there are a bunch of different ways that you can think about measuring this. So, lots of other fields have really sophisticated measurement devices. maybe we'd be using physiology, maybe we'd be using, sort of neuroimaging or genome sequencing. But it turns out, if you want to know something about a 2-year-old, none of those are the right tools. Really what you want to do is ask their parents, because their parents spend a lot more time with them than you do. And so turns out one of the gold standards, really the biggest gold standard in vocabulary assessment, is a checklist for parents, known as the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventory, or the CDI. So the CDI is surprisingly reliable and valid. So you send home this checklist to parents and you say, okay, does your child say alligator? How about ant? How about bear? How about bee, bird, dog, bunny, butterfly, cat, chicken, cow, deer, and so forth? And they spend half an hour or an hour, and they fill out all the words that they've heard their child say, or sometimes that they think their child understands as well. And you get an inventory of what they are saying, as well as their general communicative ability. Do they point? Do they gesture? Do they combine words? And so forth. These things are reliable and valid, and they're also really cheap to do because they are fundamentally surveys. For that reason, they've been translated and adapted actually into more than 100 languages. So this is a worldwide resource where speech-language pathologists or developmental psychologists in different communities adapt this form to be the early language screening for their particular population or to use in their research. So this kind of easy screening and measurement of child language is really taken off worldwide. That creates a really nice opportunity, because in each of these communities, researchers have created normative data sets to try to understand child language. So about 5 years ago, right when I was getting involved in data sharing for the first time, I started thinking about making use of that opportunity. And the result was a site called WordBank, which is an open database of these MacArthur CDIs across languages. So there are about 75,000 kids in here from 29 languages or dialects, 56 different forms. So we are now the kind of key repository for these data, allowing everybody to access the same picture of children's early language outcomes across different communities. So again, heading back over to the live site. So here's the live site. And again, by virtue of collecting these data and thinking about what the right format is to share them in, we can create a set of interactives on top of these data that allow people to very quickly prototype hypotheses and explore them. So what you're looking at here is like 4,000 odd English-speaking kids between 16 and 30 months. Each dot is a kid. This is the size of their vocabulary, and here you get your kind of classic diagnostic curves, 10th percentile, 90th percentile, so forth. So these kids down here are the folks where the parents after 2, below 10th percentile, might want to start talking to their pediatrician about language. So that's a kind of screening outcome. But you can now quickly break these down by the demographic variables we have access to. So if we switch over to a median, we can look at classic sex or gender differences in the kids and recover a female advantage, which you can also recover if you go to see my son's preschool classroom. So this is a reproducible, replicable finding. But now, and different from previously, you can see if this is also the case in Croatian, which it looks like it is, or Danish. Yep, lots of from Danish, so the curves look really nice. Or let's look at Korean. Yep, same pattern. So all of a sudden, we can now explore cross-cultural replication, in some sense, of these fundamental questions. And of course, this sort of database allows a variety of different views on the data. You can look at the career of an individual word. So table is a fun one. Table is fun because it's very diagnostic of children's language ability. If a kid can say table, they're doing quite well in general, assuming they're below 3.5. If you do a kind of adaptive analysis, table is like the most diagnostic word in this age range for whatever reason, or alligator. So the careers of these words, how fast they're learned, how slowly they're learned, how variable they are, it's an important endpoint for us in thinking about the mechanisms of early language. And of course, the more you do stuff like this, the more you can get inspired to play with the newest kinds of techniques. And so here you see a kind of a graph theoretic analysis here, where the edges are provided by a word-to-vector model, so kind of a neural network semantic space model. And so you can explore different aspects of the structure of early vocabulary and look at how that, for example, expands. So the 12-month-old has kind of isolated islands. You see more isolated islands being filled in, and then gradually connections begin to emerge between these networks of words that are related semantically. And so it turns out that this network structure is an interesting predictor of what early vocabulary looks like across kids. So by creating the data in the right format, you then make it much easier to apply these more sophisticated techniques, because in some sense, a lot of the pre-processing lift has been provided by the API, by the repository, and only the kind of last computational layer need be developed in order to do the development work. Okay, so we are kind of, we've been taking the last couple of years to do a deep dive into this data set, and have developed a kind of comprehensive manuscript that looks at all the different ways you can look at these sorts of data. Because this is not a talk about child language, I won't press you with those details, but I hope that you, if you're interested, you explore this. So it's freely available online, WordBank-book. For the purposes of this talk, the point that I want to make is that this is kind of a key case study for me of this reproducible research ecosystem. So we started out by thinking, okay, what would it look like to have a book that was about a data set that's a moving target? Well, it has to be reproducible, because the data we end up with that we're writing about now are different than the data we started writing about 2 or 3 years ago. So to do this, we turned to the R Markdown and Bookdown ecosystem, which allows the book to be rendered to a web page and a PDF from the underlying source data. So there's full computational reproducibility of all the underlying numerical results. That is, you hit knit, and what's happening is the data are getting pulled in, computed on, and then generating all of the tables, figures, and other display items in the final products. Now, of course, there are a bunch of challenges that come up when you try to do this at scale, and Russ alluded to some of these as well. How to cache computation for compute-intensive work here. So if somebody wants to redo this and they don't mind spending a couple dozen hours of compute time on whatever platform they have handy, that's great. But how do you store that intermediate compute in a way that nevertheless is refreshed and up to date as things change? And further, the reproducibility of computational ecosystems is, in some sense, an open challenge in the scientific context. There are some solutions that are out there that work better or worse for certain problems. But in general, the fact that software moves while scientific publications stay static is a critical challenge for having somebody in 10 years be able to reproduce all of these numbers and display items. Okay. So the last thing I want to show you is a research project that tries to plug together a bunch of these different data sets to try to actually get a little bit of theoretical traction. I'll just give you a little taste for this, but it's a fun example of the kind of thing that you can do when you have a research pipeline that consists of APIs for the different theoretically relevant data sets that you need for your project. So this is the work of Mika Brzezinski. They're a graduate student at MIT, formerly in my research group. And the goal of this project was to actually try to take seriously the idea of a theory that would predict variability across languages and across cultures. And so our endpoint for this was to predict which words are learned earlier or later. So we were interested in why, for example, dog is learned so early by English-speaking kids relative to some of, say, Norwegian-speaking kids. And so across the whole range of vocabulary, what are the words that are easiest or hardest for kids, and why do those differ when they differ across languages? Now, our modeling approach here is very basic. There's more sophisticated work since then. But the basic modeling work is regression models to predict which words are learned early or late. And the key thing is that we want to put together this pipeline of predictors, which words are easier or harder based on their length, based on their meaning, and a variety of predictors about their meaning, and critically about the language that kids are hearing. Now, in order to get this estimate of the language kids are hearing, we now need to have a resource that allows us to pull in the language they're hearing, which is precisely the resource that we've developed in the first part of the talk. So we're essentially merging these two pipelines from ChildlessDB and from WordBank. And then once you've done this, the estimates in the regression, the predictor weights, tell you the relative importance of the information sources. Now, if this were to talk about child language, I would tell you all about those regression weights. I don't think that's really critical here. What I think is just interesting for you to take home from this is that the predictor weights across languages are extremely well correlated with one another, far beyond any kind of random baseline. So in some sense, whatever it is that matters for children's early language, it matters in the same way across all of these different languages and data sources. So in some sense, this is really, I think, the interesting kind of thing that can come out of quantitative replication studies like this one, where you can actually measure variability across languages and cultures. You go beyond, does this exist again? Can I repeat the result? To, okay, what's the magnitude of the estimate and how does that vary systematically? You can actually use these relationships between languages to reconstruct some of the typological relationships between languages. So it's not a coincidence that Russian is a little further out here, for example, because it's typologically a little bit more distinct. So you can actually get a lot of insight into how cultures and languages vary in terms of the learning processes that the kids are going through. So the take home here was across these 10 languages, the same general stuff matters for learners. And because we have a pipeline that unites these different theoretically relevant data sources, we have a way of actually plugging these together and now swapping out the model in the middle, allowing us to evaluate a variety of different machine learning algorithms in a much more efficient and reproducible way. Okay, so what I tried to argue here is that the kind of supposed crisis in theory or crisis in replication in psychology is actually part of a broader set of questions about the intersection between data availability and theory availability. If you make data available, quantitative theorizing is easier. If you make quantitative theories, you can think about what are the theoretically relevant kinds of data that you need to put together. And towards this, the broader methodological point here is that to make this kind of virtuous cycle, you need not just broad resources are great, but also community and domain specific repositories, which store data about theoretically relevant constructs. These create positive incentives, and they also create the tools that people need in order to evaluate their work. And of course, to support this kind of theory building that we want, these repositories must be open, they must have appropriately structured APIs. And so there's, I think, a real opportunity here for the kind of micro development of repositories and resources within communities, as well as the macro development of resources for the scientific community more broadly. Okay. Thanks very much.